I'm Carl Les, I'm leader of North Yorkshire Council and the CCN spokesperson on finance. Before we do anything else, I'd just like to recognise the advocacy that our CCN team have been doing, balanced, informative and effective, and I think they should be congratulated for that. So a big thank you to them. We heard a lot about our priorities this morning. It struck me that there was one common theme in all that they all need finance as a driver. I've spent last week with my finance team at North Yorkshire analysing the autumn statement, but we're joined today for his interpretation by Adrian Jenkins from Pixel. I think he needs no introduction to most of us in the room. We will do questions after his presentation, so please can you use the app? Adrian, over to you.
Thank you, and thanks for making the effort to come along and hear about local government funding today. I think it's a really important subject, and I've been asked to go through the autumn statement today and to look particularly at what that means for local government funding. At Pixel, we advise County Councils Network and have done so for a good 4 years or more, and we also advise lots of different councils right the way across the country. So we know there's a lot to be worried about in the autumn statement. We know there's an awful lot of problems, a lot of concern there. And I think in local government, I think we can probably say that we've come out of that better than most other types of authority. I think some of that, as you said, is due to the fact of the advocacy from CCN. I think the driving narrative about what local government needs and what funding it needs has really come from CCN. I think we've got a lot to be grateful on both a political and officer level on that basis. But for local government, we've had an awful lot of additional resources that we weren't expecting, from additional council tax resources as well as grant increases. And I think looking back over the context of what's happened in the last decade or more, it's going to be the biggest cash terms increase in funding that we've had for more than a decade. So there's something to be welcomed in that. Just realised I haven't got the clicker to move forward.
Could we have a clicker, please?
On the next slide, what it's going to say is about the autumn statement. The background to that really is that it's a much worse fiscal and economic outlook than we were expecting back in March. And the Chancellor's had to do an awful lot to restore confidence in the fiscal forecast, thank you very much, with the minimum damage to economic growth. And I think one part of that, though, is that the fiscal mandate that the Chancellor has actually adopted is much looser than we had in the past, or that his predecessor had. What his main target is that debt should be falling over the next 5 years, or at the end of that 5-year forecast. That's a fairly loose, not particularly strict fiscal target that he's working with. And he's also moved away from the target that he needs to balance the budget in current terms every year. So it's a more loose stance that he's taken. A lot of that fiscal tightening as well is very much backloaded. So instead of the cuts being in the next 2 years, they're actually pushed further backwards. So I think there's an awful lot of that we can be a little bit grateful for there, that even though things are much more uncertain and there's much more pressure on the public finances, that a lot of that pain has been pushed further back. A total of £54 billion worth of fiscal tightening, and I think what's really interesting in that is that it's pretty much split half and half between tax increases and spending cuts. If we think back to 2010, that split was 80% spending cuts and only 20% tax increases. It's a really different mix. A couple of charts are just illustrating some of the background to what's been going on in the autumn statement. The first is, we can see here, there was a really big peak in borrowing during the pandemic, with all the measures that the government put in place to support the economy and individuals through that. But you can see that a slightly smaller second peak in the current year and in next year as well, partly to do with the economic slowdown, but also particularly to do with the increase in interest rates and also the short-term, the two one-off energy support packages that are coming through at the moment. So things are bad in terms of borrowing, and I think if we look a bit further forward, you can see on the right-hand side of that chart that actually the annual borrowing kind of levels out at about 70 or 80 billion pounds, which actually is quite a good deal higher than it has been under previous chancellors, when that borrowing levelled out at about £30 billion. So I think the message from that is that things are still very tight. There's a lot of risk there, and things could, if the economic forecasts do get a bit worse, things could be, the Chancellor may have to come back with even more spending cuts. And we can see here the big driver behind a lot of that, which is that spending has been increasing quite significantly, partly from the pandemic, but also since then as well. And you can really see there that the trends and the overall scale of public spending since the middle of the last decade has really increased, really very substantially. So for local government, we said at the start that it's a much better settlement than we could have expected, and it's much better than most of the rest of the public sector as well. So we've had additional resources from council tax, and also adult social care funding in particular has really outstripped our expectations of what we thought we might be getting. Part of that has been delivered by the delay or the postponement of the adult social care charging reforms. So that's freed up an awful lot of funding. Whether they're ever put back in place, we don't know, but for now at least we know that funding is being recycled to fund ongoing pressures in social care. And then some really big increases in cash terms in social care. So that's a really big difference from what we were expecting. And then council tax. I think most of us are probably working on the basis of a 2% core increase in council tax and then 1% for the precept. But both those have been uplifted. So now we're looking more like we're looking at a core increase of 3% and a further 2% for the precept. Then there's this thing called the business rates multiplier freeze. In some ways, it's a very technical part of the settlement. That's where the business rate multiplier next year, instead of increasing by inflation, 10.1%, it'll be frozen in cash terms. And what that means for us in local government is that we get compensated for the fact that the government's frozen the multiplier. And that's actually a really significant amount of money, potentially about 1.5 billion. We don't know quite how it'll work yet, but we know it's going to be a lot of money. And actually, that's the one part of the settlement that is formally linked to inflation. So finding out how that does work is going to be really important. And we found out this morning as well that the settlement will now be announced in the week beginning the 19th of December. So the last week before Christmas, which seems to be becoming a bit of a fixture. So anyone with Christmas plans, maybe rethink them. But we have heard there'll be a more of a policy consultation or a policy announcement on what will be in the settlement in early December. So at least that means you should understand more about what's in the settlement in a bit more certainty before the thing itself. So Band D thresholds, I think this took a lot of media attention just before the autumn statement, just that ministers were thinking about putting those thresholds up. But it's worth just looking at that in a bit of context in this slide. First of all, for a period, ministers were linking core increases in Band D with inflation. That's really kind of become detached since about 2021-22. But you can see in the current year, we are falling way behind that increase in inflation. So even though there's a big cash increase in Band D, potentially, that'll be much less than the real terms increase ought to have been. We can also see as well that a 3% core increase and a 2% precept is not that unusual. We've had at least a couple of years in recent times where that has been where the thresholds have been. So it's not a big hike in Band D in that sense. I thought it was worth putting it in context as well of what's happened in the last sort of decade or more. And you can see here that in the early part of the last decade, 2010 to 2015, Band D fell quite significantly in real terms and barely increased in cash terms for that matter. In the second half of the decade, things changed a little bit, and actually we started to get some quite biggish real terms increase in Band D. But you can see here in 2022-23, you can see with the scale of inflation that we've got, that actually we're looking at probably the biggest real terms cut in Band D that we've had probably ever, I'd imagine. I also thought it would be useful looking at the Band D increase in the context of inflation more broadly. So the black dotted line shows you what's happened to CPI inflation since 2010. The red line shows you the average England's council tax, Band D council tax. And you can see there, again in the early part of that decade, some really big real terms cuts in the average Band D council tax. And then since about 2015-16 onwards, the Band D started to increase very quickly in real terms. But, more recently, I think what we'll see when everything comes out in 23-24, that actually, over that entire period, council tax will probably have had a slight marginal reduction in real terms over that period. A bit of a roller coaster, but on average, it's not increased in real terms, I don't think. Worth as well seeing that the green line shows you the average increase in county authorities as well as Mets. And you can see that you've had to increase your council tax by more than the national average. The two yellow lines show you outer and inner London boroughs. They've increased their council tax by less than the national average. Now, I'll leave you to draw conclusions about whether you think some are under or overfunded. Probably a bit short of time, so I will skip over these tables, but it's basically just showing you the cash increases in funding for social care in the next 2 years. I'll put them in there because I know I've had a lot of questions from councils about the specifics of how these numbers are working, but suffice to say, there are three elements to it. The first one is there's additional new money that was announced of £1 billion next year, £1.7 billion the year after. That's the new money, some of which I think will be shared with the NHS, and I think all of which will be required to actually do more to help the NHS in terms of discharges. Then there's this recycled funding, £1.3 billion in the first year, 1.9 the year after. That's just the money that you would have had for the reforms that you're now using to fund ongoing pressures. And then finally, the precept. It's about 580, 590, 600 million pounds per year. Depends on what you actually do with the precept, whether you actually take the full 2% or not, but that's roughly the annual increase in resources that you'll get from that precept. And you can see here in this chart just how much resources for adult social care have increased over the last 7 or 8 years. And you can see there that quite a large chunk of it has come from the precept. The blue block there at the top is the increase in the adult social care precept. So it's increased steadily over that period, but the really big increases have come from these new adult social care grants, and in particular, the big lift up in 2023-24. That's a real, I think, it's not quite a step change, but it's a really big increase in additional resources for you in social care. The thing for county authorities in the settlement, though, is how does the government distribute that additional adult social care funding that's available? And I think if we take the view that they'll do the same as they did back in, for every previous round of additional adult social care funding, I think what they'll do is they will fully equalise the 2% precept. So that means that if we look at the county councils network at the top of this slide, you get about 38% of the total adult relative needs formula. So your share of needs is about 38%. But your share of the additional adult social care precept is more like 48%. So if you take that all into account, we think that your share of the grant will be lower, only about 41%. So you lose a share of grant because you get a higher share of, you've got a higher share of the national tax base, a higher share of the precept. We've worked that through for all the member authorities in CCN, and you can see here just how different the shares of different types of resources will be because of equalisation, because of different sizes of tax base. On the left-hand side, you've got Durham, relatively higher need, relatively lower tax base. We think resources there will be about 77% from grant and only about 23% from the precept. Other end of the scale, Buckinghamshire Council, 58% from the precept and only 42% from the grant. So that's a really important mechanism that the government used to equalise the impact of the precept. And for many of you in this room, not everybody, for many of you, that will reduce your share. So if we kind of summarise what some of these issues are for adult social care, we've got this big cliff edge coming up in adult social care in 25-26, big increases to that point, and also what happens with the increases that are needed to restart adult social care charging reform. Possibly we've got a new formula coming on as well, which will distribute resources quite significantly around the country. And I think for the new resources that you have got, to what degree do you have new conditions, different strings attached or ring fences? Putting all that together in terms of core spending power, big increases in 23-24 and to slightly lesser extent in 24-25. But one thing that I noticed by putting these numbers all together is I think in 23-24, for the first time since 2010, we'll have had a higher amount of core spending power. So it's taken us nearly 13 years to reattain where we were in cash terms in core spending power in 2010. So if you think about the increased inflation over that period, that's a really big deal, I think. But maybe a big landmark as well. And you can see over that period just how bad the settlements were in core spending power terms in the first part of the last decade and how much in relative terms they've been better in recent terms. And actually, we're coming here on a run of relatively good settlements, of which 23-24 could well be, in cash terms, the best that we've had. In terms of distribution more generally, we don't know how this will quite work out yet because we haven't seen the settlement, but just running those numbers through our modelling, I think that our highest increase in estimated core spending power would be in Derbyshire at about 10.3%, and the lowest amongst CCN membership at about 7.3%, so in Buckinghamshire. So what I think probably would happen, because of all the equalisation that takes place with the precept, I think that lower tax-based authorities will possibly have a higher increase in core spending power than higher tax-based authorities. So I think there'll be a bit of redistribution going on there. Of course, it's speculative. We don't quite know how it's going to work out, but that's kind of how we think it is based on what ministers have done in the recent past. Further on, from 25-26 onwards, I think that things are much more tight. At the moment, we're only looking at cash terms increases in spending and funding after 25-26 of about 1%. So we like to see real terms cuts in funding from 25-26 onwards, with the exception possibly of adult social care where things could be different. But that's quite a tight long-term settlement, I think. And finally, the verdict. We can definitely conclude that the settlement or the funding that we're getting from the autumn statement is much better than we were expecting, and much better than we thought even quite recently, and also much better than really almost any other part of the public sector. And it's a good settlement that follows on from a number of years of relatively good settlements as well. But you know and we know that that's unlikely to cover all your spending pressures. It's likely to leave you with quite a large gap still to fill. You've got both inflation and demand pressures. Speaking to some authorities saying the settlement might cover inflation, but it won't cover demand pressure. So it still leaves a big gap. And it looks a lot better in cash terms and real terms. It's the best settlement you've had in 13 years in cash terms, but it's probably the worst you've had in real terms in that sense. So, it's a bit of a mixed bag. And for non-social care services, there's nothing in there for that. There's 3% increase in core council tax, but that's it. There's no more funding beyond that. And then I think, as I've just said, the outlook beyond that is fairly bleak. Unless things improve, there's real terms cuts in funding coming down the line. So I hope that's provided a good insight into and a good summary of what's happened with the autumn statement and put that in some context of what's happened in the past. And I think, have we still got some time for some questions?
Okay. Thank you very much, Adrian. I think most of us would probably have stayed downstairs and watched the football rather than listen to all that doom and gloom.
I did my best.
Thank you. No, we're not shooting the messenger. Can we open it up for questions or comments from the floor first, please? If not, I've got one or two questions from on the app. So let's take the first one. I'll paraphrase it. Kent and Hampshire have been very open that government funding for councils isn't fit for purpose, the formula. CCN has effectively said the same. Would it help for more councils to be more open about the upcoming issues over the next 2 to 3 years?
Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, as more of an analyst, I think it would, because I think it gives ministers and officials a much greater insight into what your pressures are. And I think, to be fair, that's really helped in the last few months as you've lobbied to get more funding. You can see the results of that in the funding that you have got. It may not be everything you wanted, but it's an awful lot better than we thought it would be. And as I said, it's a lot better than almost any other part of the sector. I imagine that some of that is because ministers were aware of the pressures that you had and understood what they were. So from my perspective, I think that must be a step forward. It must be a good thing.
Okay, and then actually the second question is very, very similar. Just that we can't be complacent. How can we keep the pressure on government to look for more sustainable funding plans going forward? And what would be your key ask on them?
I think what would help authorities an awful lot would be just to understand and help to forecast better, get a greater understanding of what ministers' policies are in terms of things like social care. You saw from one of the charts there just how kind of like stop-start a lot of the policy is that we get around things like council tax increases. And some of that could be signalled an awful lot earlier. A lot of councils, I think, would like to have greater certainty about the settlement and what's going to happen. To some degree, we had that in the second half of the last decade, from about 2015 through to about 2020. Lots of councils like that. That made a big difference to helping authorities to forecast. So even if settlements are tighter, to at least understand what you're going to get, to be able to plan for it, I think makes a big difference. And that bit is within ministers' gift if they wanted to actually make that work.
Okay. And then a more technical question. Is the adult social care grant ring-fenced to adults, or can it be spent on children's social care as well?
I think from what I read in the paper, the autumn statement paper, there's only one grant that was specifically ring-fenced. That was part of the new money that was announced. And even that, I think the wording that was that it was. I think it's able to be spent on both children and adults. The recycling of the funding for the adult social care charging, I don't think that's ring-fenced at all. I'm fairly sure that you can spend that on whatever you like. But I've not seen any of the circulars yet from the Department of Health being specific about how that's used. And I'm sure the NHS are pressing a lot to make sure there are more conditions on that, to make sure that as far as possible you use it to help them.
Thank you. There's two questions from the floor on that side, one at the back and then one slightly to the front.
Yeah, asking a question from the council with the worst settlement on the far right-hand side of those slides. Just looking at the modelling we've done so far, we've got a really big problem next year, but a catastrophic problem the next year out. Is there any indication of whether one could actually roll over some of the adult social care precept in the same way that we were able to do with previous adult social care precepts? Because in many ways, I'd like to take it in the second year rather than the first.
I've not seen any indication of that. I know what you mean, that in the past, I think in 2021-22, that actually you were allowed to defer part of it till the following year. That did make a lot of sense. I've not seen anything yet about how that might work. No.
The minister's very clear, it's use it or lose it.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
There's a question there, please.
Thanks very much, very clear. I'm Callum Miller, Cabinet Member for Finance at Oxfordshire County Council. You've focused on the revenue budget, but I think one of the other elements of the autumn statement was keeping to spending plans on capital for the next 2 years and then flat cash thereafter. Some of us are engaged in various schemes with central government funding that are multi-year, and I don't know if you've had a chance to analyse that or have any views on what it means for our capital budgets going forward.
To be fair, I haven't looked very much at the capital side of things, but I think that's part of consistent with what we've seen on the revenue side as well, which is they're sticking with 2-year spending plans, and it's very flat, it's very tight from 25-26 onwards. And I guess what would happen there is that that's for a future government to work out based on what the economic forecasts are at that point. I'm sure they won't stick to those figures.
Okay, any other questions from the floor, please? One down at the front, please.
Is it possible to go back, please, to the slide where you showed the increased funding? There was a slide that showed increased funding and where it came from since something like 2015.
I can't do it.
Bar chart.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
it looked like the bars were going higher and higher. So I had a look at when I was first elected in 17, and then I had a look at now. Mm-hmm. If we look at that slide as a trend rather than as that one.
That's just social care, that one.
So if anybody looked at that as a trend, mm-hmm. they'd be pretty alarmed, wouldn't they?
In terms of spending on social care?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, actually, if you do extend the axis out to the left as well to look at 2010, you'll see that spending on social care and funding for social care fell in cash terms quite dramatically over that period. And it kind of turned round and it's increased. It's been playing catch-up, I think, for the last 5, 6, 7 years to put more money back into social care.
And would you have any understanding how much of that is driven by pressures, as in numbers of people, and how much is driven by cost? Do you know?
I haven't seen that analysis, no, but I mean, that really is the government kind of responding to the fact that you've got all those pressures, that you know, authorities reporting back to them about the scale to which you're struggling with the financial pressures from adult social care, and then responding to those. And
none of the councils in this room or anywhere else are just stashing money away in the bank, are they? They're asking for that money because they need it.
Yes.
So I just looked at that. I've never seen those figures before, and I just thought, if that's a trend, and then we're hearing what you're telling us for the next years to come, flat cash, then actually what we're looking at is something much more worrying than what we're looking at today, isn't it?
I take your point. That's partly the case. I think the issue is going to be that in 25-26, the indications from the autumn statement are that the funding for the public sector generally and for us generally in local government is fairly flat, maybe 1% in cash terms, which is a real terms cut in funding. But I think what we've seen, and that shows you quite clearly, that when ministers are faced with the problems from social care, they do put their hands in their pockets and find more money because the service just does need it. And without additional funding every year, you as authorities will just struggle to deliver that service. I think the government needs to find at least 750 million, if not £1 billion per year, just to fund your increases in adult social care and children's social care. And without that, you get into really big difficulties. And I think they realise that. And I think the reality is that you will see, come 25-26, there will be more money available for social care, either through general funding, council tax, or specific social care grants.
Okay.
It's just worrying not to know about it.
Any last question from the floor, please?
Thank you. So just going back to your share of additional funding from adult social care grant and precept, was that over both years? And is that including the Better Care Fund funding? So is that everything? Or is it just one next year?
The figures that I showed you were just for 2023-24, just to illustrate the interaction between the grant that's available and the precept that you're expected to charge.
And does it include the Better Care Fund money as well?
It doesn't include the Better Care Fund money, and but what I showed you there equalises the full precept. So any other grants that were allocated to you, they wouldn't need to adjust for the precept.
Cheers.
Okay, thank you. That brings us to 2:15, our allotted time. So I'd just like to thank Adrian for giving us that presentation, bleak though it may have been. Thank you. But that is the weather.
Right, good afternoon everyone, and welcome to this new session on housing and planning. I'm Roger Goff, leader of Kent County Council and CCN spokesperson on this area. Delighted to welcome Peter Freeman, Chair of Homes England. This is, I think, an area of huge national priority and some very specific features that relate to county areas. We have some of the highest house prices in the country, with properties now being 10 times average earnings in our areas. And affordable housing delivery is lower in county areas than other parts of the country, with just 23% of homes delivered in the last 5 years being classed as affordable. For many of us, the whole world of housing targets and expectations and above all, perhaps the question of the infrastructure that should go with that remains a major political and financial challenge. We've seen, of course, a huge area of flux on this, in particular in terms of planning policy over the last couple of years, going all the way back to the White Paper, the various provisions coming in and sometimes apparently going out of the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, and a continued debate about the continuing role of targets in securing the home building that we need as a country. We come at this, of course, from a variety of perspectives because some of our members here are unitary authorities and therefore housing authorities, others operating within a two-tier system. But in both cases, albeit from a slightly different angle, exceptionally important and challenging as an area. CCN has been working hard on the bill, and in particular lobbying for the reintroduction of strategic planning to give parity to county areas and to boost effective cross-border working in a way that doesn't take place at the moment, in particular in relation to strategic infrastructure. And indeed also a great deal of debate over the shape of the infrastructure levy and what role that may well play as well. So an enormous amount going on in that area, and meanwhile all of us as authorities deeply engaged in this in our local areas, seeking to ensure that we can support the delivery of high quality and well-connected developments that will be properly supported through infrastructure and meet the needs of our communities. One of our key partners in this is Homes England, so I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Peter in joining us and to give an overview of the work of Homes England, but I know there will be great opportunities for us also to raise a number of questions. Just briefly to say that Peter qualified as a lawyer and then formed the Argent Group of property companies with his brother, I understand, in 1981. Argent's played a major role in terms of mixed-use projects like Brindley Place in Birmingham and King's Cross and Brent Cross Town in London. Peter's also been a non-executive director on several other property companies and a trustee of a number of charities connected with education, combating intolerance and public performance art. Peter was awarded a CBE for services to housing and communities in the New Year 2020 honours list, and in that same year, in October, became the chair of Homes England. So Peter, welcome. Very much look forward to what you have to say. Thank you.
Homes England operates very much at the other end of the spectrum to adult social care costs, because we are interested in long-term built space, so it's sort of capital rather than revenue. But at the end of the day, it's all part of creating a society in which it's good to live. And we believe the better the homes that are built, the more the mix of them, the more the homes come together to create places and communities and have different tenures and properties for different people at different stages of their lives, the less we will have burdens of social welfare, policing, health and whatever. Housing is a fundamental underlying foundation for society. And I've spent 38 years in the private sector, so I was a little nervous about stepping into the public sector, and I think you're all very brave in serving the country in the public sector. In my brief 2 years, I've had 4.5 Secretaries of State. That's 5 appointments, but Michael Gove's had the appointment twice. I've had 5 housing ministers, and I think one of my jobs is to try and make government understand how long-term the process of getting the right housing is. And as Roger said, you know, it's not just the right building, it's the right building in the right place with the right infrastructure. And the infrastructure isn't just a dual carriageway or a vaguely available railway station. It's making sure the schools and buses and doctors' surgeries and parks and playgrounds. The 15-minute city is a much-used term in urbanism. Most of my development has been sort of urban regeneration, like at King's Cross and Brindley Place in Birmingham. And you know, the density of activities where you can walk children to school. I think some of my happiest days in life started. I had 5 children walking children to school when they were small. And if you've got to drive them and be in a traffic jam, it's not the best start to life. So Homes England is increasingly thinking about place. And when I described it to Michael Gove on his first arrival, when I'd been there a year, he said, so Homes England is my Swiss Army knife for any housing problems. Put another way, the people at Homes England say, oh, bugger, they've chucked another one over the fence at us. When I was before the Select Committee to be approved for appointment, Clive Betts, who's the chair of the Select Committee, said, well, are you just going to do whatever the Housing Minister says? And I said, well, probably not, because I'm a little insubordinate, but probably yes, because actually he is the boss and the money comes from him. And if I'm not making the minister happy, there will be less money and less flexibility. So although we are an arm's length body, we are clearly there to help the government achieve its aims. And we're clearly there not to sort of pick arguments between parties and manifestos, but to drive as far as we can a long-term portfolio of activities. And the portfolio of activities is very diverse because they lob them over the fence from time to time. So, at the extreme end, although our main responsibility is to create more and better housing, we manage the Help to Buy portfolio, which is about 250,000 second mortgages, which, it didn't just help people onto the ownership ladder, it did probably create at least 50,000 homes that wouldn't have been built without that leverage. We manage the cladding remediation sort of funding. So there's things we do that were lobbed over the fence, which aren't actually directly at producing more homes or communities. But the main things that we do to create more homes is a series of funds, of which the best known is probably Housing Infrastructure Fund, where we give grants to local authorities when the local authorities would like some housing land to come forward, but it needs a new bridge or school or spur of a dual carriageway. And a thing to say is we don't actually build a single home. We do quite often put in infrastructure ourselves, but on the basis we're not trying to compete with the private sector, we do not build homes. So we put in infrastructure funds, we put in infrastructure. We sometimes assemble land when normally a council approaches us and says, we thought we'd have 5,000 homes on the edge of Didcot. 4 of the landowners have agreed. The 5th landowner's being tricky, won't share the infrastructure, and we will take out the 5th landowner and then sort of become a consortium with the other landowners. In Burgess Hill, we took all 3 landowners out because none of them could agree how they would share the costs. We have a big programme called the Affordable Housing Programme, where we give about 1.5 billion a year of grants to housing associations. And that is really the only money they now have for new housing, other than when it comes through Section 106. We have a big programme for what's called housing market diversification, which is largely to make sure that the SMEs stay robust. The SMEs have been sort of bashed back from probably being sort of 40% of the market to about 15% of the market. So it's very important to preserve them, partly because they're the only people who will take up some of the smaller schemes in some of the smaller places. Partly they're probably more willing to sort of do vernacular design in the place that they come from. And we also support, as part of diversity, modern methods of construction. So we make loans to some of the people who are really beginning to bring forward new products, factory-designed homes, because it's another way of getting more homes built. And we're putting together at the moment a cross-cutting subcommittee of the board with lots of external experts. Most subcommittees of the board are just board members, but we brought in the people who know most about modern methods of construction, about green buildings, green energy, and whatever. And we have a power, in a sense, because we give people grants and loans and we sell them land, we can enforce standards that are possibly higher than national standards, and we're looking how far we should go with that. We don't want to push off buyers, we don't want to make things unviable, but if we can set exemplary standards, we'd like to achieve that. We work in greenfields and brownfields, depending on which minister and manifesto and remit, it varies. When I came in 2 years ago, we were significantly targeted towards expensive counties in the southeast where the land was very expensive, and therefore we were trying to increase stocks there. Gove 1 probably pushed us towards regeneration and the Midlands and the North. Simon Clark was probably bringing us back to the south. Gove 2 is probably saying go for the whole country. And in some ways, I'd like to go for the whole country, even though we had limited resources, because actually we need to be opportunistic. And in terms of sort of saying to you, what sort of relationship would we like with you, and what local authorities do we want to work with, and how do we make the opportunities? As a developer by background, a developer has to be opportunistic. I discovered early on trying to persuade a landowner who had no intention to sell was a bad idea, because either he wouldn't sell or he'd suddenly realise your land was valuable. I actually talked to the Commission for the New Towns in my third year in business in 1984. Commission for the New Towns is a kind of another bit of predecessor to Homes England. And I said, that site, that would make an amazing food superstore. And they let me spend virtually all the money that we had on consultants until we proved that it could take a food superstore. And they said, well, we'll put it on the market. And of course, we couldn't afford to buy it. So opportunistically, you should do business with people who want to do business with you, who are ready to do business. And from my point of view, you know, there are some local authorities, county councils, unitaries, where the politicians, regardless of the party, are really united about what they want to achieve. They're very clear about what they want to achieve. They've got a view that, you know, goes beyond the immediate election. And they're the sort of people we want to work with, because development takes a long time. You know, I've said several times to all the last three ministers, and even more so as the financial crisis worsens, you know, there are two things we can be doing that are two completely different timescales. We can be working to get houses built in the next 2 years, but those sites need to be sites that are really already allocated, probably already in the hands of a competent developer or housing association or council. And we can help get them built basically with loans and grants and financial support. And then there's the other thing, which is for the next 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years, which is working on strategic sites of 1,000 homes, 5,000 homes, 10,000 homes, with local authorities who really have a vision that this is what they want to do, whether it's significant expansions of existing towns, whether it's building a new town. I'm personally quite an advocate of new towns, because you can build the kind of walkability to primary schools, and you can build jobs into the new town too. And I worry that too often much housing goes on places that are already commuter settlements and aren't going to have any jobs, so you're just creating more commuters. But as I say, I'm in a sense ultimately agnostic. I'm there to help local authorities, landowners, developers make things happen as far as possible, make them as good as possible. One of the ways we try and work to build a sort of ongoing rapport, and I should probably mention a term that wasn't familiar to me before I came to government work, capacity and capability, which I'm sure is familiar to all of you. Quite often when I'm with sort of council leaders like Abby Brown in Stoke, I assumed they were after our money, but they're very often after our capacity and capability too. We employ, I think it's 80 people who are planners by background, but we employ people who are kind of lawyers, people who know about CPO, people who know about civil engineering, people who know about legal agreements. And so when a council is at an early stages, we're saying, gosh, you know, I really want to do something strategic and significant on the edge of this town or in this county or between councils. We really are there to kind of help put it together. And that's in two senses. One is our own in-house expertise to just quickly scope how viable or practical something is and which bits of government kind of capital can be raided to help it. And the other is to say, you know, these are the right sort of consultants, and this is the right kind of brief to the consultants. I won't say which mayor, but a mayor proudly told me the other day that he has commissioned major firm master planners to start doing master planning. And I said, you know, you've worked out kind of stuff about viability and rents and yields and take up and whatever. He said, no, we'll do that afterwards. I said, you have to do that probably before, but certainly at the same time, because otherwise the master plan is just a pretty drawing, and you will lose a year and probably £500,000 on fees on it. So, you know, we have that sort of expertise, and we work, and places that we're working particularly closely with, and quite often we sign a kind of memorandum of understanding, so there's a big moment with the leader of the council or the chief executive. In South Essex, we're working with Essex County Council and about 6 local authorities across Thurrock, Barking, Romford, all those areas, because they're all on the same A12, A13 corridors. They've all got the same issues of rundown land that was next to the Thames and industrial, but also the potential for lovely waterside parks. They've all got the commuting into London issues. So we're working at a very holistic level with them, with Sheffield. We've just signed up something with the Yorkshire and North Yorkshire devolution mayor. In Bristol, we've signed something that involves the city, the West of London, West of England Combined Authority and the university. We've put 96 million of funding into improvements around Templemead Station that will probably lead to £1 billion of development overall. An important metric in selling these things to the Treasury is that whatever we put in is ultimately going to be leveraged a lot by the private sector. I could say something about the economic cycle or the economic crisis. It's going to be bloody tough, but actually there's always an economic cycle and we always get through it. And I think for the longer term things, the most important thing isn't to pause. If you don't spend the money on the master planning and the viability and beginning CPOs or whatever this year, then you've lost a year when there's more money around to do it. So if you've got long-term plans, don't put them on hold. We can probably help you with some money for consultants and some choice of consultants. That's probably enough from me.
Peter, thank you very much. Now, we've got a series of questions. What I might do is I will take first actually a hybrid of one that's on the app and indeed one which I know is has been raised by a number of people. So perhaps we can I'll mix that in, and then I think I will throw it open to the floor and alternate between that and what is on the app. But Peter, what the question from on the app was that large sums for key infrastructure have been promised for strategic housing growth. These may be time limited. The pandemic and global inflation may be affecting the rate and cost of delivery. Will Homes England be flexible over these arrangements given the current situation? And similarly, the point I had raised was the impact of inflationary pressures on allocations such as under Housing Infrastructure Fund. So just be interested in your thoughts on that one.
The current Housing Infrastructure Fund has a limited life and things need to pass kind of through final hurdles relatively soon. And there may end up having to be some sort of shifting between ones that are not getting through the hurdle and ones that need a little extra support. But we will try and get as much money as we can from the government. We will try and get as much extension of time. But the point I made earlier about sort of local authorities to work with and how, another point I didn't make, to an extent, we sort of sit on a sideline because we're not a principal. Just as we don't build houses, ultimately it is the council or the developer who, for the most part, puts in infrastructure. And in a sense, the psychology of being a government supporter has been to slightly sit on the consultant's bench. We're helping you do it. When you call us to come to a meeting, if you can meet all the criteria, we'll give you some money. And I and the current chief executive, who are both very private sector by background, would like to kind of sit on the front bench rather than the consultants or trainers bench. And some of these things that may fall away because infrastructure costs, building costs have gone up so much recently, we think, God, if we'd been pushing from the front, they would have actually been on site and the contracts would have been placed 18 months ago and there wouldn't be the problem. So if we do get into kind of bed with you, if we try and push a bit harder, hopefully it's helpful.
Good, thank you. Can I see any questions here in the room? Yes, lady at the front there.
Thank you. I should have said my name's Liz Lyshon, Deputy Leader at Somerset County Council. I'm hoping that I'm right in understanding that Homes England may be looking at the possibilities of helping with some sites. We're looking in Somerset at a traveller site and also at some modular homes and some off-grid living. And what I'm hearing through a town deal is a much broader way of thinking from Homes England. And I'm really hoping that's the case, because with house prices continuing to rise and the economic crisis that we have now, my real worry is that we're going to see more and more people living in vans. I see a lot of that where I live, and there is a real demand and a hope that there may be other ways of living that don't cost a minimum of 200,000 to put some kind of roof over your head and warmth. And I just wondered if that's something that you're talking about as policy at Homes England, or whether we're just been fortunate in finding a way into one particular area of your work. Thank you.
I'm not aware of your specific plans, but if you send me a note afterwards, I'm happy to get back to you on them. I think we want to attack housing need at every level of the market. One of the things actually I'd really like to try and do, and talking to Michael Gove about, is to what extent some of the Treasury rules around public land being sold can be varied. There's one particular hospital authority where I know personally the person who's chair of their property committee. And she says they are sitting on lots of land where the hospital is, on a town ring road of a major town with high values. And they say they won't put a planning application forward on it because A, it will be contentious because it's actually in that town's green belt, so they probably won't get it, or it'll cost an awful lot for consultants. But B, if they got it, all the value in it would immediately be hoovered up by central government. And she is saying, do you think that the government might allow us to put in an application purely for key worker housing for people working in the hospital? Because if yes, she thinks that she get it through the planners, because nobody can say no to the NHS, and also as opposed to this will all be commuter housing with more traffic jams as people come into it, it would actually be the reverse of commuter housing, because it would be people working on site at the hospital. And the sort of maths of those kind of things is that if you were building on a greenfield site in the curtilage of a hospital with zero land cost, ordinary social affordable rents would basically give a yield on the building cost. And one of the problems is that land has become too expensive, and that's perhaps because not enough of it is allocated. And so I think the public sector sits on a lot of land where it sort of sits in a kind of semi-delusion that the land is one day going to be very valuable. Therefore, it must be sold for the highest value, but you can't get the value out of it now because the planners won't permit it, possibly rightly so in the example I gave. And there may be a completely different, sort of more virtuous circle where the public land is used for public housing. And you bring the price down, the need for grant down.
Thank you. I did see one indication at the back. Can I take that question, and then in the remaining time I've got 2 or 3 on the app here, which we'll get through as many as we can. So just gentleman at the back there.
Thanks very much. Sorry, Callum Miller again, Oxfordshire County Council. So first of all, you mentioned flexibility, and I just wanted to thank you and colleagues for the work we've done together on our HIF schemes in Oxfordshire. But they've also highlighted climate change as something that has changed, and our expectations both of housing and of infrastructure have changed almost as rapidly as some of the economic outlook. You mentioned briefly modular build, but I wondered if you could say a little bit more about the role that Homes England is and can play in helping advance some of the climate objectives, given the huge role that you have potentially in setting expectations around how we build infrastructure over the next, as you say, 5 to 25 years.
I mean, on the modular, we are a significant funder of several manufacturers, plus we are encouraging, so for example, on the affordable housing programme, housing associations taking grant money from us have to build at least 25% of their homes with some form of level of modular construction. And that becomes a kind of slightly virtuous circle, because we're funding the factories that make the stuff, and we are encouraging the customers or the house builders, housing associations to buy the kit. On climate change itself, we aren't publishing at the moment any different standards to those coming out of loads of government bodies and RIBA and all sorts of other people. But the point of the cross-cutting committee we've just set up under somebody called Sadie Morgan, who's an architect on our board, but is also the chair of the National Infrastructure Commission's Design Board. We hope that what will come out of that will be a kind of user-friendly guide across the piece, and something that we would be prepared to set our standards to.
Thank you. We've got time probably just for a question or two from those. What I think I'll do is there are two questions I'll pick out from those which are on the app, if I could just pass. So one is from Ruth George. How is Homes England supporting local housing trusts, and what can councils do to assist? And the other one, which well, there's a whole number of interesting questions here, but one is, how might Homes England play a role in encouraging local communities to see the wider benefits of housing developments, as opposed to, stereotypically, the negatives? I suspect we won't have time for much more beyond that, so my apologies to anyone else who put a question on the app, but over to you, Peter.
On the first one, showing my ignorance, I'm not sure to what extent a local housing trust is different from a housing association with a specific geographic remit. Anyone help me?
within a particular area, and local district councils have an obligation to have a list for people to opt to self-build. So local housing trusts are where that can be put together to help support infrastructure and gain the land needed. So it just seemed something that can be done to empower. It's about empowering communities and local people who want to self-build. Anyone from Cornwall, I think, have done some really brilliant work on this as a great model, and it would be fantastic for those community enterprises to be able to leverage some of the funding and support that's needed.
Right. I know we were doing some work on self-build, not particularly local housing trust, but one-off self-build, because it's very hard to get a mortgage for self-build because the lenders are worried about whether you know how to build or not. So we've warmed up a few lenders to do that. Can I get back to you on the local trust? My fear is whether in numeric terms they kind of fall below. I'm sure we'd help in principle, but it's easier to help larger housing associations doing more. On the question of how do we help change the mind of people to support development. Yes, if only there were more yimbys, yes, in my backyard. I've been slightly frustrated because for the first sort of year and a half, I was told, Homes England should sort of stay away from the press. The press is for the department and the ministers. And I actually think that from a personal point of view, I feel one of our missions is to get out there and say that housing and building communities and building welfare and happiness and productivity are one holistic thing. And I spent the first 20 years of my life as a developer basically doing one-off buildings. They might have been a bit better than some people's buildings, but they were one-off buildings. And then almost by pure luck, I ended up buying Brindley Place in Birmingham, which was 17 acres in the town centre. We built 3 new public squares within the 17 acres. We did offices, residential, retail, an art gallery, a sea life centre. And suddenly I realised that the power of doing mixed use and the kind of increased dwell time and enjoyment. And then I went on to do it again at King's Cross, even more so with much higher residential component. And although you wouldn't want every bit of your green counters turned into King's Cross and there isn't demand for them, what there is demand for in every community is places people can come together, whether it's a village hall or whether it's a local theatre, all of those things, whether it's shops, restaurants, pubs, sports facilities, trying to recreate a sense of pride in place, a sense that you don't have office quarters that close down on Friday evening and are dead for 2 days, and residential quarters that are dead between people leaving home on the school run and going to the office in the morning and coming back in the evening, trying to make more places so that they all live, work and play, and attractive places to be in the street. The government's created an office for place sort of within the department run by Nick Boy-Smith, who invented Create Streets. And I completely support what he's doing because it is about making places more beautiful. But it's not just about making them more beautiful, it's making them more permeable, safer, making people want to be in streets. Benches and trees make a difference. And it must be part of our mission to help people who advocate for housing have supporters. I said to the chief executive of CPRE when I met him, I said, look, I completely understand if you object to 9 out of 10 applications, but you've got to choose 1 out of 10 that you think is better, and you've got to support it. You've got to show that there's a reward for developers who do things right, because at the moment it's a kind of relatively binary situation. Most applications either go through because it's the next place that has to be permitted on a kind of sequential test, or they go down. And if councillors would start saying, actually, I have that one, it's not so sequential, but they really are offering a fantastic park and a new school, and they've sorted it out with the bus company, to turn the allocation of land a bit into a bidding for the provision of amenity and beauty would be a fantastic achievement.
Peter, thank you. I think that's a very good note on which to end, and it's something which Homes England and our member councils could, I think, unite. So thank you very much for that, and thank you for taking a whole number of questions and spending your time with us. Thank you.